I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about foster care. Now I know you're probably wondering why doing a writing tips video about foster care. Well, the main reason is because a lot of the forums that I'm a part of, subreddits, things like that, there's a lot of writers who actually stop in and ask about foster care. They ask questions. And when I first saw them, I thought, well, why aren't they just doing the research? It's kind of ridiculous. Well, the problem is that the research doesn't always make sense, and the system, unless you've kind of gone through it, you don't always understand what's going on with it and how it works and the functions and how reunification works and all that stuff. So we're going to kind of walk through it. We're going to do a very basic thing where I'm not going to be talking about like the ethics of foster care, why people do it. I'm not going to try to recruit you. I am a foster parent, but I don't want to recruit you to become a foster parent. I want you to understand foster care well enough that you can actually start, when you're writing your book, you can actually know what you're doing, and you don't have to go to the subreddit and ask people questions. And hopefully the information I'll give you will give you a jumping off point so that you know what to research when you're doing the extra research, because hopefully you're not just using this video as your research. What I really want is to make sure that writers have a basic working knowledge of foster care and the system, so that as they write their books, they can write believable characters and information. We are talking mostly about people writing fiction, and I will talk about some books in here that I think have done a good job, or maybe got it mostly right, and we'll see how that turns out. The thing that I have to stress the most is that every single case is going to be different. Even though there's kind of a set way that things are done, every single case is different from one another for a variety of reasons. Kind of get into some of those reasons, but there is a wiggle room for authors to kind of play around when they're talking about this kind of stuff, and I want to be clear that you do have that wiggle room. So the first thing is how foster care works. So starting on the foster parent side, foster parent is going to sign up with either an agency or they're going to sign up with their local county. All right, we were actually with an agency and then we switched over to our local county. You will be assigned a social worker, that is your licensing worker, and they're going to go through all the process, and they are going to get a mountain of paperwork from parents. They want your financial records, they want your pay stubs, they want your, I'm trying to think of everything. They want you got to have a physical done, you have to submit almost like these psychological assessments asking you about your family and your relationship with your parents, your relationship with your siblings, if you're having infertility issues, therapy that you've gone to. You have to sometimes get a letter from a therapist or a doctor just clearing you to be a foster parent. I think when we turned ours in, it was 42 pages long for each of us, not just one of us. So we each had to turn in separate as a couple. And then you have to take classes. And the classes are, in my state, they are 30 hours. And they cover basics of foster care, expectations of foster parents, trauma-informed therapy, or just kind of the understanding of trauma of kids in the system. And hopefully they cover some of what you can expect as a foster parent. If you want to be a therapeutic foster parent, you have to take an additional, I don't even know, I think it's 15 or 20 hours of training, and that's for kids who have more severe behavioral needs. If you don't have a therapeutic license, you will not get kids with those really severe behavioral needs. Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. The system for kids is very different. There's a couple of ways that kids end up in the system. Typically, kids are alerted to a social worker, and there's a couple of different ways. There's sometimes where people call and the social worker goes out to check on the home and they can see that there's signs of abuse and neglect, and they go take the kid out of the home immediately. Sometimes it is a couple months process. A lot of places now are trying to give parents help, and so they don't take the kids right away because they try to give them parenting training and things like that, and so trying to keep the kids in the home, and sometimes that doesn't work out and they end up having to remove the kids. Then there are emergencies or emergency placements. Those kids come into care when they have found severe, usually the police has been called or something, and they show up at the home and there's a kid and they are being, neglected, traumatized, or abused, and they need to be removed, or there's things like drugs involved. And then there is abandonment to the system. So a parent decides that they just cannot parent their child anymore, and so they take their kid to the, local county office and leave them there, or take them to the hospital and leave them there. This is all very traumatizing, of course, and we're going to talk a little bit about trauma in a minute. But so that's the basic path. And then you wait a couple months, because it takes a couple months for all this paperwork to go to the official wherever, and then it has to be signed off, and they look at all your stuff, and they inevitably lose something, and then you have to send it again. And hopefully, if everything's okay, anywhere from 5 months to a year, you will get your license. And you'll be licensed according to how many kids or beds that are in your home, separate beds. So if you have a 3-bedroom house and 2 of those bedrooms are for kids, you might be licensed for 2 kids if you have 2 rooms in there, or 2 beds in there. Okay, so basics. Placement of kids, and we just kind of talked about how kids end up in care, is very different based on the adult and the child perspective. So obviously a foster parent is going to have a very different perspective than a foster kid. I think about this often where, we had a kid show up on our doorstep. I think we got a call at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They dropped her off at 5:30. For me, I was a little nervous, just because a new kid's coming. And so I was kind of rushing around making sure that, the bedroom was clean and everything was ready to go. I wasn't going through a traumatic period in my life, though, and when this kid showed up on my doorstep, they were in tears, and they were having a very hard time, and they were very upset, and so I was trying to be very sensitive to that. Obviously, her experience is so different from what I experienced as the adult. So kids often don't know what's going on. They'll fall asleep in the social worker's car on the way to your house, and then when they get there, they don't wake up until the next morning, and there's some strange bed. They don't even know where they are, and they're confused. So when you're writing, and you're writing from a child's perspective, or even an adult who was a former foster youth, you have to keep some of those things in mind, of like those traumas of even like the first initial contact. It does not matter how nice the foster parents are or how mean, that just the transfer itself is traumatic and very difficult. The kids don't know where they're going. They don't understand. Sometimes they don't understand the language. They speak a different language. It's all very, very difficult. So you got to keep all that in mind as you're writing. It's also an opportunity, of course, to have an unreliable narrator, either as the adult or the child. If you're doing the foster youth, their experiences are coming from a place of trauma. So they may relate to the adults and narrate the story in a way that comes from that place. If you are using, and maybe what they're experiencing is not necessarily what's happening. Or maybe it is what's happening, and the adults are the ones who are the unreliable narrators. They're telling everybody that they're wonderful and good people, and maybe they're not. And then I talked about like emergency placements. Emergency placements are like, we got this kid and we took them out of the home and now they need to be at your house tomorrow. Or tonight, 2 a.m, whatever. Some of those are only like 24 hours, maybe 48, not very long. Sometimes those placements end up lasting a little longer. Just there's so many reasons why they can end up staying in your home for longer. And then you've got temporary placements where they call and they say, you know what, we've got this kid. Their uncle wants them in a different state. It's going to take a little while for us to get all that paperwork together. Can you take them until they go to their uncle's? And you say, yes, absolutely. Or no, depending on what you want. Then there's respite. Respite is almost like babysitting, but only foster parents can do it. And the state basically allows current foster parents to basically get a break. Okay, so we do respite, and we get regular kids to babysit regularly, and so they kind of get to know us and they know who we are and stuff like that, and we really enjoy them coming over and having fun. And then you have permanent placements where you don't really know what's going to happen, but the kid's probably not going to be removed from your home. They're going to be with you for a while, or at least until their case goes to the end. And then we've got disruptions. And this is something that people know a lot about because we hear a lot about it, where kids are bounced around the system. That is a very real thing. It does happen. It happens for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's because the foster parents are unrealistic about what they can accept or take, and they will get a kid who just is beyond their ability to parent, or they have unrealistic expectations of kids. They'll say things like, well, I don't allow teenagers to say curse words in my home. And of course, the first thing that teenagers is going to do is say a curse word in their home just to see what happens. There are cases of kids where the foster parents is like, out, Kids are also bounced around sometimes because their needs, when they first come into foster care, nobody knew that they had like such severe trauma, and that kid needs to be moved to a home that can actually handle the level of trauma that kid is experiencing. They try not to have disruptions, so obviously, any way that they can keep the kid with you, but sometimes it's not a thing. But because of that, and because of unrealistic expectations, and sometimes not good foster parents, and sometimes kids who kind of sabotage their placement on purpose, maybe, and for good or bad reasons. Sometimes they do it because they're like, this place is awful, I want to leave. They do bounce around. And so there's kids who will come into a home that had been in 6 homes in 4 months, and just kind of, bouncing through the system. So Kayla Carter wrote a book called Forever a Long, Long Time, which is a fantastic, very beautiful example of a kid who's been bounced around a lot and is really struggling with feeling like she belongs anywhere. I love Kayla Carter, by the way. I love her books. Anyway, so though the idea of their kids bouncing around happens, and it happens all the time, and there are kids who will be in the system for years because their case is like taking a while to go through the system. A question that I see a lot in the subreddits are questions about like, who are all the people that are involved in this process? Like, who are all the people that these kids will come into contact with? So you've got your doctors. Kids will go to an initial doctor visit, but they'll have a regular doctor as well, dentist, that kind of stuff. Then you've got your therapists. For each child in your home, you're going to have a different therapist, hopefully. Your kid should not be seeing, like siblings should not be seeing the same therapist. They'll talk to each other. They actually talk to the court, and they talk to the social worker. So that's the other one. They have a social worker, and they have their own social worker that's assigned to them. And then the foster parent has their own social worker, like a licensing social worker, who's in charge of just keeping the license, giving them, information about trainings and stuff. That's something I forgot. You have to do, in my state, you have to do 20 hours of extra training every 2 years in order to keep your license and keep it updated. So then you've also got teachers that the kids are involved with. Keeping kids in the same school is preferable. And then you've got guardian ad litems, or GALs. Guardian ad litems are assigned by the court. They're volunteers, and their job, and their only job, is to look out for the best interests of the child. Or that's what their job should be. Sometimes they have a huge caseload too, and things don't always go the right way. I don't know, but we worked with a guardian ad litem who is absolutely fantastic, and we're still waiting for a guardian ad litem for our current placement. So now we got to talk about reunification, and this is one that is a little confusing, because when you hear the word reunification, you think a child has been reunited with their mom or dad, right? They've been returned to their family. Reunification in foster care actually just means that the child has been returned to their family or close family friends that are within their own sphere circle. So in my state, there is a 73% rate of kids being sent back to their family. So it's a pretty high rate, and a big chance that most kids, the large vast majority of them, are going to end up going back to some kind of family. That's often a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, cousins, things like that. But it also could be a close family friend. Like if the child is really close to a teacher, and the teacher says, I'll take this kid, that kid is considered actually in a kinship placement, which is what they call when you're an identified family, even though that person's not related, because they are close to the family or close to the child. They are considered reunified and in kinship with their family. There's also out-of-state transfers where somebody's moved to a different state. So I had mentioned earlier, you have a child in Nebraska and that child needs to be moved to Florida where their, aunt and uncle live. The kid will go into foster care and then wait a couple of months because it takes a while to get the paperwork done. It's called an ICPC. And it's a contract that's made between the states so that the child can move from one foster care system to the other. It is a very long and very drawn out process, very frustrating often for the kids because they know they're leaving, but they don't know when. And, so everything feels like up in the air all the time. So a book that did this really well, I felt, was The Great Gilly Hopkins by Catherine Patterson. It's kind of almost become a classic. I think the movie was really good too, where the child has been in the system for quite a while and eventually the grandmother is able to get custody of her child. And so that, her granddaughter then moves into the home with her, has a little bit of some unrealistic expectations. It is also a little prickly. So, you got to deal with this kid who's been through a lot and been bounced around a lot and has a hard time kind of, connecting to her grandmother as well. So I thought that was a good one to show kinship placements because that it does happen a lot where a kid will be in the system for a while before an identified family is found and then moved. Then you have adoption from foster care, and this gets convoluted and crazy. So it can take years. Obviously, a child who's just a foster kid, and I don't want to even say that just lightly, but when a kid is in foster care, the plan at the beginning is always to try to reunite them with their family, preferably with their mom or dad. But if that's not the choice and they start looking kind of further afield, I guess, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, you cannot adopt a child until the parental rights have been terminated. They call it TPR, termination of parental rights. That has to be terminated so that the kid is available for adoption. And then at that point, grandparents and aunts and uncles and anybody is available to or able to adopt them. Now, how does that work though if you're a foster parent, and you have a kid in your home? Most kids go back to their family, but what if this kid doesn't have any family? Or the family that they would go back to is just unsafe. They've looked at all the aunts and uncles and grandparents and determined that it's just not a safe place for that kid to be. At that point, they might ask the foster parents, are you willing to adopt? And not all foster parents are willing to adopt. Some foster parents really just do it to help kids. And so they will help transition a kid into an adoptive placement home. Adoptions do not happen the minute a child moves into a new home. If the child is still considered a foster kid, they'll live. Let's say that there's a family who says, you know what, we would love to have that kid. And that child is moved from their foster home into this new adoptive placement, or moved from a group home or a children's home into their adoptive placement. They have to wait usually about 6 months. And that's to make sure that it's actually going to work and that there isn't going to be a disruption or, a canceled adoption kind of thing. And then after 6 months, they can apply for the adoption and the paperwork takes months again. And so again, this whole process, it takes years. Okay. So Vera B. Williams wrote a book called Home at Last. And it's a great little picture book about older child adoption. The kid goes and moves in with his dad's, and I love it. But the only thing that's inaccurate is that it says that the child is adopted and then moves into their home. And that's not how it works in foster care. The child will move in first and then wait 6 months and plus, whatever the court system takes before adoption is finalized. And that's just how it works. International adoption, completely different. Baby adoptions, very different. Okay, so talking about if you adopt a child from a birth family, that's a whole different animal from foster care and foster care adoptions, okay? And then we've got aging out. So of course, you've got kids who are in the system and some of them are not available for adoption. They just turn 18 and they age out. So what happens to them? So there's a couple options and lots of very big decisions that they have to make at 18 years old. They can stay in the system. Most states, not most, all states have an 18 to 21-year-old program that teens can stay in. Comes with a lot of strings that are attached. You get some good things, like they'll pay for tuition at like a community or a state college, or they might have some price matching if you like save up to buy a car. But if you get in any trouble, you're out. Okay. A lot of teens try to take advantage of that, but you know, some of these kids, like, they're really struggling, and staying on the straight and narrow for a couple more years is really difficult for them. And some kids are like, I am so done with the system. Screw it. I'm out. And they turn 18 and they're done. Okay. So those kids, maybe they have a friend they can stay with or whatever. They leave their foster home. Some get dropped off at homeless shelters at 18. They just turn 18. It doesn't matter whether they've graduated high school or not. They turn 18, they're out, and they just got to figure it out for themselves. And some flounder and they really struggle, and some, kind of just, manage to pull it together. But most kids, it takes about 2 years for them to get on their feet. And here's a sobering statistic: 43% of young men on the streets under the age of 25 are former foster youth. So a lot of them still are on the street for a long time. So if you're writing a book where a character is about to turn 18, 18 is not as exciting of a birthday as opposed, to a normal life. Because it's scary, and there's some big decisions that have to be made, and you're not sure what's going to happen to you or where you're going or what's going to happen next. What I Carry by Jennifer Longo is a good book that talks about a character who's really trying to figure it out, and she's 17 and she's got one more year, and she knows that these big decisions are coming and she doesn't quite know what to do. The last thing, the big thing, is trauma. So I talked a little bit about the beginning about trauma-informed parenting. There's also trauma-informed therapy. These kids who come into the system, no matter what age, I want to make that very clear, whether they're 1 year old or 5 years old or 10 or 15, the very act of them being taken from their biological family and put into foster care is traumatic. Okay. And then you add traumas on top of that. If they experienced abuse, or if they experienced neglect, or both, if they were, treated badly, if they, the different kinds of abuse that there are out there, all of those things play into the trauma that the child experiences when they come into care. Those things are shown in a variety of ways. A lot of books, I feel like, often show like anger, and I don't think that's wrong. Some kids are really angry, and they should be. They have every right to be angry about the way that they've been treated. But there's a lot of other ways that it shows itself. It shows itself in low self-esteem, blaming themselves, saying that they're the reason that they're in foster care, struggling with like self-harm, seeking out unhealthy relationships with other people. They have trouble bonding with the people that they do know because they've been bounced around so much. They have huge trust issues. There's like a lot of things that a kid who comes into care and has trauma, sometimes it doesn't show in those ways. It just shows in like a deep sadness sometimes, or a trigger, or they just get angry really fast. And as a foster parent, sometimes you can catch those things and you know that you've triggered something and you don't know what it was. Sometimes you'll never know. But those are all ways that trauma kind of shows itself. And again, it even shows in young children. There's a very common misconception that because something happened to a baby, they don't remember it, and therefore they don't have the same issues that an older kid would. And it's actually very wrong, because that child doesn't have the verbal way to express the trauma that they went through, and they don't even have the memories of it, but they have all of the feelings and the brain changes that happened when they went through that trauma, and they can't even express it. So you have to think about these things when you're writing these books. So a couple good books that talk about trauma really well, having to do with foster care: Orbiting Jupiter by Gary Schmidt. Really talks about the rights of foster youth, but also those feelings. So the character in that story is a teen father who is not being given any rights to see his child, and he desperately wants to meet her and see her and be in her life, and he's being told no because he's a foster kid. And there's a lot of really good stuff in there. There's one for the Murphys by Linda Mullally. I always want to say Mulaney, but it's Mullally Hunt. And that one has a not understanding what it's like to be in a normal family. If you've never eaten dinner at a dinner table and then you come into a foster home and you're expected to eat dinner at a dinner table, it's going to feel weird, and I love that the way that the character interacts with this new world. And to us, the reader, who's not been in foster care, it probably feels very normal. Like, why is she bucking this? But it makes sense when you talk about trauma. And then there's The Mercy Rule by Perry Class, which is about a former foster youth who is now an adult. She's a pediatrician, so she's a doctor. And she's really struggling with some of the triggers of, she is a mandated reporter. She's supposed to call, CPS when she thinks that there's been abuse, but she's also been through the system and she doesn't really want to put kids into the system. And so there's this constant internal struggle within her. And I think it's very, very well done. So that's basics of foster care, and hopefully I've given you some language so that you can, at least give you a way to look for research and start looking for things in your state. A lot of this information and statistics are public access, so you should be able to find them for your state and wherever you are. The biggest thing that I want to challenge you to do is that, like with all good character development, try to make it realistic. If you're going to have a character and you're not going to follow the standard orphan trope, which is not really a thing anymore because kids, even orphans, end up in foster care, right? There are a lot of different ways to deal with it and a lot of realistic ways to deal with it. And so I want to encourage you that if you're going to write a character, or even a secondary character, he's just, the next door neighbor is in foster care and they're friends with them, here's some information and that'll hopefully help guide you so that you can create a more realistic and well-rounded character. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing tips almost every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Ink. I hope your writing is out of this world.